I'd like to introduce Professor Caroline McCracken-Flesher to you. She's a past convener of the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literature, an honorary fellow of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies, and holds the Order of the Stag from the Clan Scott Society. Caroline and I met in DC several years ago when she gave the speech to the immortal memory at our Burns Supper for the Washington St. Andrews Society. And I'm delighted that I'm going to have a chance to interact with her again today, although it's virtual this time. Just a note about Caroline, although she's in America now and has been for quite some time, she's an Ulster Scot by birth, and she might allude to that in her remarks. She's also an internationally recognized Sir Walter Scott scholar, and that's very pertinent to what she's going to be talking about today. She's going to talk a bit about how the big anniversary of Sir Walter Scott that's coming up next year in Scotland is going to be celebrated at Abbotsford and in Edinburgh and elsewhere, especially in light of the public health situation that we're facing. So with that, Professor McCracken-Flesher, good morning.
Good morning, John. It's a pleasure to be with you. If my preferences in Zoom were working, you'd see a lovely picture of Scotland behind me, but instead you're looking at Stonehenge, for which I apologize. my thanks.
Looking at Stonehenge, but that's fine. Coming through that.
My thanks to the Scottish North American Community Conference for the invitation to speak with you today, and my thanks to the organizing team. I'm going to share a PowerPoint to help us through this particular presentation, to give you some things to recognize as we progress. And as John said, my focus is on Scott. I will be talking a little bit about Scott 250, but I'll also be talking about why Scott 250 matters. That's really the emphasis this morning. And I said I would talk about Scott and the strangeness of Scotland and the idea of America, right? On Scott's 250th birthday, I'm thinking about how Scott helped to remake America in the 19th century. And at Scott's first centenary in 1771, this may seem unlikely because in 1771, when Scott was, it was 100 years on from his birth, even then a writer to the Boston Transcript pleaded, "Will you please tell us what is meant by the Scott centennial? We hate to appear so ignorant when everybody else is talking about it." And that audience has a point. Scott never visited America. He never wrote about America. He was an Edinburgh and a Borders boy. And now on his 250th birthday, what can Walter Scott have to do with America? The fact that Scott does have something to do with the idea that emerges America is evident on bookshelves across this wide continent. If you visit any historic house or even any historic cabin from New York to California, you will find Scott on the shelf. Let me show you a couple of examples. I tend to go around looking for Scott on the shelf, and believe me, I always find him. This is the Byers-Evans House Museum in Denver. It is the home of the first editor of the Rocky Mountain News, and Scott is on the shelf. Down below is the encampment mining and tie hack village in Wyoming, in Encampment, Wyoming, and it's on Waverly is on a shelf in a cabin in the Encampment Museum. Now, many an American city has its Kenilworth, as you know. It's Woodstock. If you're in Chicago, there are whole areas of Chicago named after Scott novels and characters. And if you type Waverly into Google Maps, you could end up anywhere from Maine to Iowa to Ohio to Illinois, Oregon, Maine. The list pretty much covers the entire map, including, by the way, a crossroads in the middle of nowhere in northern Colorado. 19th century America, now I'm going to push it a little bit, even looks like a Scott novel. The European artists who traveled the West looked outward with an eye that had been trained by Walter Scott. Thomas Moran drew on J.M.W. Turner. J.M.W. Turner was coached by Scott on how to illustrate the provincial antiquities of Scotland, and then Turner kept on with it and eventually illustrated a lot of Scott's books. So the influence, the artistic influence, is actually a little bit shared between Scott and Turner. And you can see how Scott was so interested in the prospect with the people in it. And that's what Moran ultimately picks up. And all of this, however, tells a very different story about Scott in America than the one that most people know. And that story that's spread by Mark Twain in Life on the Mississippi, Scott set the world in love with sham grandeurs, sham gods, and sham chivalries. And that's G-A-U-D-S in the sense of fancy clothes. Twain's focus was the American South. And in his opinion, Scott's historical novels served an illusion of superiority that led to a civil war. In Huckleberry Finn, the wreck that entices Huck, but is really the scene of murder and decay, is called the Walter Scott. But that was Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens, in fact, visited Scott's house at Abbotsford in August 1873. He bought and was delighted to receive the Abbotsford edition of Scott's works, and he liked it so much that he ordered a second copy. And as that divided response of Samuel Clemens, AKA Mark Twain, makes clear, the relation between Scott and America is complicated. It depends on the perspective that we bring to the stories that Scott tells. By way of example, the St. Louis and Keokuk Packet Company did indeed name its side wheelers. I think I skipped one. I have lost this slide. There it is. There's Sam Clemens in the guest book, by the way, at Abbotsford. There we are. The Packet Company did actually name its side wheelers for the heroines of Scott novels. But Scott's women are no shrinking violets in need of chivalry. In Rob Roy, Di Vernon is the feisty horsewoman with inside knowledge of rebellion. In The Heart of Midlothian, Jeannie Deans, though she may be a lowly cow feeder's daughter, walks all the way from Edinburgh to London to meet the Queen and save her sister from execution. And as you might expect, the side wheelers that are named for such redoubtable women themselves had remarkable careers. They brought the Union Army to the front during the Civil War. So if the Sir Walter Scott in Huckleberry Finn stands for a decrepit society, the actual ships served a more complicated reality. And complicated reality is, in fact, what Scott gave to 19th century and to an America in civil turmoil. So what do we owe to Walter Scott? That is than colorfully clad Jacobites on our shortbread tins. Let's begin with Scotland's own phrasing for a promising lad, a lad who can turn his hand to anything, a lad of parts. And Scott was a lad of parts. He began as a lawyer, as a member of the Edinburgh Volunteer Cavalry during the Napoleonic era, because he liked to dress up. And soon he was a translator and a ballad collector in his own right. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 careers already in these 2 pages because he turns into a poet. And he had many simultaneous careers throughout his lifetime, and they linked him to many worlds. So we know that he became a novelist, and he was an antiquarian of note, which is represented here in this frontispiece from an addition to his works. He was also a builder, of imagination, an architect who would plan Abbotsford with his architect and then sit down with the masons in the stoneworks and discuss what was going on. He was an agricultural improver. In this painting, bottom right, from David Wilkie, we see a somewhat rural Scott family with the young ladies in bare feet. I don't know if that ever happened, but nonetheless, it represents Scott in his role in the country as, for instance, a seriously invested in the renewal of forests. And Scott was also an impresario who helped bring George IV to Edinburgh in 1822 and to market Scotland to the world. And you will not be surprised to know that it involved a lot of tartan, but I'll talk about that perhaps at another on another occasion. Scott, I'm asking you to think in these terms. He's a cultural broker. And this portrait by Thomas Fade, it brings together many creative writers. John Gibson Lockhart in the middle, James Hogg is here, John Wilson is here, very famous people of their era, all of whom knew Scott, none of whom were actually together at Abbotsford, and certainly they were not there in 1849 when Thomas Fade paints this picture. And Byron had been long dead and is in fact represented by the urn on the mantelpiece or on the side table. But Scott knew everybody. He knew scientists. He knew, as I said, the workers at Abbotsford. When he writes in his letters, he's as interested in whether the birds are being fed, whether the maids are remembering to shake out the crumbs, things like that. He was interested in everything. And his wide interests and abilities can be traced to his earliest work and his appreciation for the long inheritance of Scottish story. In his first major publication, The Minstrelsy, we find the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer. And Thomas the Rhymer dates from the 14th century. It is about the same area. But Scott's ballad collecting of the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer becomes ballad writing, as it should, because ballads are living things and they change voice to voice. And how Scott rewrote this particular story tells us something about Walter Scott. Thomas the Rhymer is invited by the Queen of Faery to go to her land. And such agreements generally don't work out well. Keats wrote a poem on the same subject where the knight simply doesn't work out well. And things do not look promising for Thomas the Rhymer because they travel in murk nacht, and there was nae sternlicht, no starlight, and they waded through red blood to the knee, for all the blood that's shed on earth runs through the springs of that country. There's an implicit critique here that faery and the human world are linked by violence and death. Syne they came onto a garden green, and she put an apple frae a tree. She pulled an apple from a tree. Now, of course, we've heard that before, right? And we know that that doesn't work out well either. But in this story, it takes a turn. Tak this for thy wages, true Thomas. It will give thee the tongue that ne'er can lie. And that should be a good thing, a tongue that can never lie. But true Thomas immediately speaks back. My tongue is mine ain, true Thomas said. A goodly gift would ye give to me, and doth neither speak to prince nor peer, nor ask of grace from fair lady. If you give me a tongue that can never lie, I can never actually speak to anybody because there's a certain amount of fudge, there's a fudge factor in speaking to people. You need to speak to them in the way that they can hear you. So the cultural role of the writer is to recognize all things, to present all things to those who need to hear in the way that they can hear. And true Thomas is known for sort of oracular prophecy that is often slightly misunderstood. He's always right, but you may be wrong in your reading. So Scott tells tales in the model of Thomas the Rhymer, tales that provoke us to listen and to think. And for an example, I'm going to direct you to Waverley. 1814, Scott's first novel. He was a successful poet, and then he turns into a highly successful but anonymous author of novels. And he typically writes in these novels about the contact zone between cultures where oppositions intensify, right? Between Jacobites and Hanoverians, Saxons and Normans, Roundheads and Cavaliers, even Muslims and Christians. And he writes about those places and moments where those rivers of blood that flow through Elfland find their source. In Waverley, he's writing about the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, and you might expect a relatively swashbuckling story, certainly an adventure story, full of daring do. But Scott spends his first chapter telling you that whatever you're expecting, that's not what you're going to get. This will not be a romance, he says. It won't be a Gothic horror. It's not a story of the fashionable scene, no Georgette Hare, although of course that comes a lot later. No tale of sentiment. At least we say to ourselves, the central character is Waverley. It's going to be about Waverley, right? But Waverley, Scott says, is an uncontaminated name, bearing with its sound little of good or evil, accepting what the reader shall hereafter be pleased to affix to it. Now hold on to that thought. Again, it's with us, what the reader hereafter shall be pleased to affix to it. And indeed, there's not much to Waverley. He is a naive young man. He joins the British Army out of romance and because he likes how he looks in the uniform. When his commission takes him northward, he is shocked by the difference in wealth. As you can see in the top left, he's disturbing the laundry maids. He gets entranced, however, by the locals until he is literally carried away by events he doesn't understand. And that's what's happening in the right-hand picture. And before he knows it, he's in full-scale rebellion with the Jacobites. And that's the bottom picture. Note that that is also a Turner. So far, so romantic. But then he recognizes that he's traveled beyond his limits geographically and ethically, and he patches things up as best he can. So Waverley, the character, is not exactly a hero. One critic of the day called him a very amiable and very insipid sort of young man. And Scott himself called Waverley privately a sneaking piece of imbecility. Well, why would you write a character who is a sneaking piece of imbecility? If Waverley is no role model, he is nonetheless very human. He lives a life true to experience in that he's a bit unformed himself. So when he meets lots of people with different political and personal investments, he misunderstands most of them, but his inadequacy to the situation forces him to manage. And at the same time, it forces us to think. The lesson we learn is that just as Waverley builds connections and relationships between things and people that shouldn't go together, so can we. Waverley, that is, works like Walter Scott. Scott never met a character or a person who didn't interest him. He never met a moment that didn't intrigue him. He was open to others and to experience, and thus he invites us to be similarly open, to welcome complexity, and to be human together. And the best Scott reader works like Waverley in the face of adversity, managing their way through whatever befall. And that is Scott's great lesson to divided times and peoples. It's been that stories, well told and well read, can activate communities of knowledge and of understanding. And that was a meaningful lesson for 19th century America. And it was a lesson that brought all sorts of Americans to read and also to reproduce Scott. For instance, Washington Irving, Herman Melville, both visited Scott, or both visited Abbotsford, and both sought to emulate Scott's architectural and cultural inclusivity at their American houses. Ulysses S. Grant visited, and so did Jefferson Davis. And this brings me back to Mark Twain and to the contribution of Walter Scott to American culture. In 1853, Harriet Beecher Stowe visited Abbotsford. She wrote of her approach to Scotland in terms of the community that is song and story, and of Walter Scott. She says, "The sun went down and the night drew on, and still we were in Scotland. Scotch ballads, Scotch tunes, and Scotch literature were in the ascendant. Ah," said I, "this is a thing that comes only once in a lifetime. We shall never come into Scotland for the first time again." "Ah," said another, "how I wish Walter Scott were alive." William Wells Brown came to Abbotsford in 1851. Brown had been enslaved and escaped. In Britain, he learned that because of the Fugitive Slave Act, he could not return to America. And so he went on a tour that brought him eventually to Scott's house. And he sat in Scott's chair, thinking that 100 years hence, no place will be more frequently visited in Scotland than the home of the late Walter Scott. Scott, that is, spoke to people. He engaged people. And one of America's most famous and fearless children shows us why. As John Belisai mentioned yesterday, Frederick Douglass, with all the world to choose from, in freedom took his last name from Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. Why? Well, perhaps because in that 1810 poem, warring factions move beyond a heinous past. They recognize that past, but from it they choose to weave a different future. Now, this is why I would suggest 250 years after Scott's birth, we continue to visit Abbotsford and want to celebrate Scott's life. It's why there have been Scott conferences all around the world, and why there will be a conference in Edinburgh in July 2021. Right? So there's things still happening. That conference will be in person and online. And it's why, with Matt Wickman, I've co-edited Scott at 250, Looking Forward. In that book coming out shortly, some of the really important Scott scholars of our moment think about the various threads that run through Scott's work and that trend toward a better future. Scott connects with this moment. He has a lot to teach us. If we can read like a Harriet Beecher Stowe or like a Frederick Douglass. And so with conferences, with the Edinburgh International Book Festival, with Abbotsford going to be open, with events in planning right now, I strongly encourage you to pack your bags for Scotland 2021-2022. And don't forget to pack your Walter Scott. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. All very interesting. Let's see if we have a couple of questions. I don't see any in the Q&A box at the moment. Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question of the speaker, you need to type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, because we don't have the technological capability for you to ask a question out loud.
I will address one thing that might come to people's minds as they're looking at some of those slides. For instance, that slide that has the wonderful signature of Samuel Clements at Abbotsford, AKA Mark Twain, right, that we only discovered relatively recently. With Abbotsford, University of Wyoming has a project to review the visitor books. We're hoping to transcribe all of them and make them searchable. And one fascinating, for the first 100 years, right? So we won't be trenching on modern times, but one of the things that will be possible if we can get it done, and it is a long project for which we've had just a little pilot project with limited internal sponsorship. But if we can do it, it will mean that, for instance, John Belisai, you'll be able to say to yourself, well, I'll just check all the Belisais who might ever have visited, or whatever part of the family might have visited Scotland. Do you think that they might have been at Abbotsford? They should pop up. Or if there's a particular part of the country or place that you're interested in, did anybody from Wyoming ever go to Abbotsford? You should be able to find that out. So we're, at the moment, we're just transcribing. We hope to make it a digital resource that's available to search, remotely, and that you would be able to track someone of interest to you who might have showed up in the visitor books. And believe me, it's a fascinating project to undertake, and you find all kinds of interesting things in those books.
Thank you, Caroline. We do have one question, and then we're going to wrap it up here. From Don Comer. Scott's style is becoming unreadable to modern young readers, as is Dickens, for that matter. And yet the stories are so compelling. Why have not more Scott novels been adapted for the screen? Scott was made for Netflix.
You know, that's a very, very good question. I think the last statement from that person is a really good one, that Scott seems made for Netflix, right? For 30 episodes that can be parsed out sparingly, because they are long and complicated plots. Scott requires time for things to cook, for his characters to change from the very naive young man that is Waverley at the beginning, who really is part of a romance novel, to someone who gets carried away by events, and then he has to be carried away by those events and has to have time to learn through those circumstances and meet people with their own biases and emphases and so on. And so that's difficult to produce in something very short. But the extended drama, I think you're absolutely right. There have been films based on Scott's work. And of course, opera. Scott was hugely popular in 19th century opera. Some of the ones that we really take for granted, like Lucia, et cetera, they're from Scott. But in terms of the readability of Scott, that's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? And it's one that English professors deal with all the time, where we can get our students to that point, but for the general reader, that's a little tough. There have been some careful modernizations of texts, and I think that's the way to go, is with work by people like Jenny Calder and things like that, where there's text can be made accessible in different ways. And of course, there are comic book versions of Scott's novels that themselves are classics, going back to Classics Illustrated.
Thank you, Caroline. All very interesting, and we encourage everybody to watch for more information on the events scheduled for next year for Edinburgh and Abbotsford on the 250th anniversary of Sir Walter Scott.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to move.